the past century, the U.S. has made great strides in equalizing the educational opportunities of all its citizens. Starting in 1946 with the National School Lunch Act, the federal government began providing free or reduced-cost lunches to qualifying students in an effort to close the achievement gap between socioeconomic classes. Because, let's face it, no child can learn when he's hungry. Feeding kids was revolutionary, but it didn't do enough to close the achievement gap in schools, so Congress kept trying. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is arguably the most important piece of legislation to ever transform the public education system. The law made it illegal to segregate or deny any one specific group of people for their differences. But to really understand the impact of this law, you have to understand the history of public education in America. Way back in 1896, the Supreme Court found in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson that as long as separate facilities for the separate races were equal, it did not violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guaranteed equal protection for all under the law. This meant that white kids went to one school and black kids went to another, and those schools were not equal. The black kids had inferior textbooks, school buildings, supplies, and teachers. But the ruling of the Supreme Court held for more than 50 years. Finally, in 1954, in the case of Brown v. the Board of Education, the Supreme Court overturned the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson and ruled that in the field of education, the doctrine of separate but equal had no place and was, in fact, detrimental to minorities. Even though the ruling made school integration the law of the United States, many states refused to comply well into the next decade. It was with the Civil Rights Act of 1965 that the federal government threw its muscle behind Brown v. the Board of Education ruling. Finally, kids of all color could learn side by side. The very next year, in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty, the federal government declared it would provide financial aid to educational agencies serving areas with a concentration of children from low-income families. This Title I funding allocated $1 billion a year to schools that qualified to expand and improve their educational programs to meet the needs of educationally deprived children. Just 3 years later, Congress realized that the act hadn't gone far enough, so they introduced Title VII, the Bilingual Education Act, which provided funding for English language learners. And 4 years after that, Title IX was adopted, which made it possible for girls to learn the same things as boys and get the same funding for their activities. In just 7 years, the education system had been completely overhauled to help minority, low-income, and female students succeed. Education in the U.S. was evolving and becoming more and more inclusive. In 1990, the Individuals with Disabilities Act was enacted to protect the rights of students with disabilities and to ensure that everyone received a free, appropriate public education. This means that teachers today have a variety of students in their classroom with different learning abilities and individual education plans that they must incorporate. Yet even with all these radical changes, the achievement gap across demographics remained. In 2001, Congress passed the No Child Left Behind Act with the belief that setting high standards and establishing measurable goals, educational outcomes would improve. This has been the most controversial education reform to date. Annual testing to measure academic progress was put in place, with schools needing to show adequate yearly progress with an increase in test scores in order to win federal funding. Instead of closing the educational gap as was intended, the No Child Left Behind Act actually widened the chasm, with successful schools getting more funds and low-achieving schools, typically in low-income neighborhoods, losing funding they desperately needed. So what's next for the education system? On January 12, 2015, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan laid out a bold new plan to create a law that will improve access to high-quality preschool, foster innovation, and advance equity. Is our education system perfect? No. Are we working on making it universally available to every child in America? Yes, we are. And that's a beautiful thing.
Created using Powtoon.